What's up, you awesome geeks? It's time for a room build marathon. We're working really hard right now on the next expansions to our build and realize that many of you are just getting started on your own. And we asked ourselves, how can we help you? And we've come up with a collection of projects that'll take you from start to finish on an entire wall section. So grab a drink, some tasty snacks, kick back and relax, and we're gonna start things off with one of my all-time favorites. Here we go.
Today in the Smugglers Room, we're fixing a hyperdrive. Or maybe I'll just show you how we built the Star Wars panel. Today's Star Wars inspired panel is one of many that we're going to have in the Smugglers Room build. If you're not familiar with what that is, hit the link above and you'll get a full breakdown. Now, what I want to do is take you through how this was put together. The panel itself was cut from a 1/4-inch MDF sheet. It was then sanded, sealed with lacquer, and then painted with multiple layers of both gray primer and then a gloss gray spray paint so that it had a reflective surface. Since the whole surface has already been painted, when we get started and we're going to apply different aspects to this, if we're going to do anything that has to glue, the surface has to be cleaned off, which means we have to take some kind of tool, which I'm using here as a chisel, and just scraping away that top layer of paint, followed by a little bit of sandpaper so that the glue has something to adhere to. I was able to find these square buttons here on eBay, a 100-pack for $15 plus shipping, and they fit perfectly with this project. For these types of projects, you want to add items that up the level of interest. This is especially true if you can find objects that are contrasting in color, but also unrecognizable, at least to the average person. If you're anyone that's ever worked with computers, you might recognize these. They're hard drive motors, and you guessed it, I got them on eBay. A 54-pack for $25 plus shipping. One man's junk is another man's greeblies? eBay really is a great place to find random objects. But if you have a friend with a laser cutter, sometimes that can be better. This piece on the lower right-hand corner was cut with a laser. It's MDF, sandwiched together, glued, sealed, and painted. Then I added the colored plexis underneath the little windows. It's just another random part that makes up the look of this panel. Alright, let's talk about pinstriping. In the Star Wars universe, it's almost impossible not to notice the borders that are put on all different types of control panels and in cockpits. This frame is often seen around LEDs, switches, and other random parts to indicate some type of importance. To achieve this look, we buy the pinstriping that you can find at an automotive store. It comes in a variety of thicknesses and colors. Typically, I buy the silver, the red, and the white because that's what I see most often in the films. Once you get all the pinstriping done, we're just moving forward by adding other elements to the panel. The key is not to push it too far. You don't want it to look too busy. Less is more in most cases. I would say just tap your inner geek and let the force drive you. The last thing I worked on before doing all the electronics was adding the depth. A lot of these areas were cut out with the intention of having something behind there, so that when you looked at the panel, it looked like either the cover was taken off or that you could see the internal workings of whatever was happening behind that. When it comes to the electronics on this, it's super simple. It's basically LEDs, any amount that you want, wired up to an Arduino. It's very simple code. It's just a little bit of randomness to help you give the illusion that there's something working back there. This right here is wired up to a 9-volt battery, but it easily could be converted to have an actual power cord, which we'll do on a lot of the stuff that we're going to do in the basement. The panel itself turned out really good, and I have to say I'm super happy with it, though there are a few changes that I want to make before I put it into the room. and it's way too clean for a smuggler ship. If you want to see what we're going to do next with the actual Smugglers Room project, or you're just looking for other geeked out builds, then hit that subscribe button. And don't forget
Now that you have your taste for Greeblies, let's talk about kits. This next project, we used a kit essentially that was laser cut, and we did a lot of different things to it. And if I may be allowed a shameless plug, if you're looking for your own kit, we have a whole collection available right now on the website. You can find that in the description below. In this project, we're going to use a bunch of different types of techniques, show you everything from selecting your own Greeblies to painting and weathering, and we'll be able to add this to the room build project. Let's see this.
Today in the Smugglers Room, we're building an interface panel similar to those seen in the Star Wars films for a droid to connect to. Okay, for a taller droid to connect to. Hey dude, watch it! You're just mad because if I put it at your height, it'd only be 12 inches off the ground. Now, as we said, today we're building a custom control panel that we hope has similar design features as those seen in the films. This particular panel is based off of the designs that you see in the film, where R2-D2 pulls out his arm, plugs in, spins the device around, and communicates with the computer. In our case, it's much higher than a droid can reach, because I want you to be able to see it. As I mentioned before, if we put it at Lefty's height, it would be pretty short and you'd never notice the panel. It might also be good for me to show you where in the room this column and the panel are going to be installed. This column here goes on what I call the south wall, or the poster wall. It's the location I'll mount a very cool poster of A New Hope, framed and given to me by my late father-in-law. It's a great themed section of the room where I think the poster display will look really nice. We're starting out with some excellently laser-cut MDF pieces, courtesy of Greg from the What a Piece of Junk YouTube channel. These are just fantastic. Then the Simply Limeade lid, one of my favorites, a lens from an old camera found on eBay, a plexiglass laser-cut droid socket design, 4 small plexi tiles, and then a few Greeblies that I've saved over the years from some old electronics. Now, I'm constantly asked, where do you get these great Greeblies? And I'll tell you, I take everything apart. If it's an old electronics piece, I take it apart. If it's an old camera, I take it apart. Take stuff apart. You'll be amazed at how many great things you can find. Now, on the column, first we have to identify where the actual panel is going to mount and mark that out. Then we have to prime and paint the base layer of the panel. I also wanted to have some contrasting colors with some silver, so we masked out a section, peeled that away, and then sprayed that with some metallic Krylon spray paint. In order to paint the Simply Limeade lid, we have to clean off the residue. I use isopropyl alcohol for this because it evaporates and doesn't leave any trace behind. The other aspect of the lid are all these plastic ridges you see. We have to cut those away so that the lens itself will fit snugly and all the way down to the base. I wanted to airbrush the socket with a really cool copper color, but I quickly realized that I needed to thin this out with alcohol designed for the airbrush paints. You want it to be about the consistency of milk. That way you don't get any splattering or any hiccups in the paint and it comes out nice and smooth. The laser cut frame had a bunch of small holes all around the perimeter that were screaming to have some kind of bolt in place. So I took a bunch of hex bolts that I stripped out of taking apart an old computer tower. They're pretty unrecognizable, they're small, and they fit really nicely into all of those holes after a little drilling. For the socket, I simply measured equally from all 4 sides and then glued it in place. And then in the center, I added some extra Greeblies. Now, I know this no longer makes it a droid socket, but I figured since my little buddy's too short to reach it anyway, why not add it? Hey man, I thought that'd make you feel better. I needed to diffuse the light a little better on the 4 small panels on the side. So I took some sandpaper to the back of the plexis, and that helped to spread the light and not have quite so much a hot spot. Now, the way they're mounted in there, it's still pretty hot and it doesn't equally distribute, but we might be able to fix that later. For the weathering on this panel, we simply did an acrylic black Mars paint with a little bit of water, pushed it really good into all the corners and crevices, and then wiped away from the surface with a paper towel. I have absolutely no plans for any part of the Smugglers Room project to be clean. We're going for a used universe here, so everything is going to be filthy. Sorry, Mom. Now, as far as LEDs, nothing brings a prop to life more than a little lighting. And in this case, it's very simple. We went with 4 3mm LEDs with a white hot color. This setup is super simple. It's the LED, a resistor for the positive lead, and then a ground for the negative lead. We also used a barrier strip to land all the wires. It's just a small strip where each wire can land at a screw terminal. It makes it very simple and very clean to get all your wiring in order. Now, we mounted up everything inside the column, and when we do the final assembly, we'll seal both sides so that you can't see all the wiring and the terminals inside the column. To power these LEDs for now, they're wired up to a 9-volt battery. But when we do the final installation of the entire wall, these LEDs will get wired back to a central Arduino board. That way, this, along with the rest of the wall display, can get some animation and some programming. But for today, I just wanted you to see how they would be illuminated. Now, the final install is just about lining up everything correctly and making sure the panel is square on the column. We also needed to install our lid and lens, so that's marked out in the center, and I also added a cool little greebly bolt to anchor it into the column. Since you can walk up and look into the lens, I wanted something interesting behind it, so multi-purpose and interesting. Oh, you shut up, it's cool. So as you can see, we're getting a...
So at this point, we've gotten our hands dirty. We've done a couple of small-ish projects, but now it's time to get into something big. Now it's time to start assembling our first wall.
Today in the Smugglers Room, I'm making a foam, paper towel, and Mod Podge sandwich. This isn't no BLT. I'm calling this an MFP, a Millennium Falcon Pad Sandwich. It's just the kind of diet I'm on. That's coming up. Alright, so this is part 1 of what we're calling the south wall, or the poster wall. You can see here in this animation that it's the section of the room that has our Star Wars A New Hope poster displayed on it. But before we could actually work on it, we needed to assemble the wall in our shop in a mock-up scenario. Once this was all set up, we were able to go in and measure all the different sections of the wall so that we could put our poster exactly where we wanted it to be. Knowing where this poster of awesomeness is going to live allows us to determine exactly how big and how many pads we can have on this wall. Raise your hand if you don't know what the heck we're talking about when I say pads. Alright, good enough. Let me explain. These pads that we're talking about are seen all through the Millennium Falcon's interior. In my opinion, they're iconic and instantly recognizable for that ship. You can see them bordering all the different entranceways, as well as all the corridors inside the Falcon. Now, for our ship, we wanted it to be instantly recognizable as well as being a YT 1300 model freighter. Not familiar with what a YT 1300 model is? That's okay, we'll get to that in a future episode, I promise. So for the pads we're going to create, we're going to use 2-inch thick insulation foam. The great part about this material is it cuts super easy on the table saw, or you could use a handsaw or even a razor knife would get the job done. It also sands easily, which you're going to see more of in a moment. Once we cut all the pads out, we do a quick test fit against the wall. This allows us to see kind of where we are and what we have. Now, all the pads in the Falcon are rounded over, and so they will be in our ship. In order to do that, we bought a 1-inch roundover bit and installed that into the router, and then we could run all the foam cut pads down the edge of the router. This gets us about 80% of the way there to achieving the look we're after. So to get 100% of the way there, the rest of it has to be done by sanding and shaping until we get all that roundover exactly where we want it. Okay, geeks, pro tip and serious safety concern. When you're working with hazardous materials or you're working with something like foam, and breathing that in can get straight into your lungs. So don't be an idiot like this chubby geek and make sure you're wearing a respirator or some type of facial protection when you're working on your projects, and stay safe. Now, I wanted these foam pads to have some damaged areas, so we busted out the rotary tool and used a whole bunch of different bits to carve in these scratches and marks within the pads. I'll tell you that this worked really well, but I overdid it, and it wasn't the first mistake on these pads that I made, but we'll get to that in a sec. Okay, let's talk about foam and Mod Podge. And who was I to think that this little container of Mod Podge was going to be enough? Silly geek, you need a lot of Mod Podge for this project. In order to protect the phone and prepare it for paint, we have to apply a good coat, 2 layers to be precise, of Mod Podge over the foam. This stuff is great because it's not toxic and it's easy to apply. I just used a disposable brush and evenly coated all of my foam pieces twice. I also used the paintbrush and the Mod Podge to try to add some texture. Now, this also failed, but don't worry, we're getting to my mistakes on this project soon enough. Now, once your Mod Podge is completely cured, you can start applying the paint. I had Home Depot mix me up a gallon of latex paint in an off-white color. This allowed me to use my critter gun to evenly spray across all the pads. Thanks, Punish Props. The critter gun hooks up to my air compressor and does an awesome job of spraying even coats all over the pads without any brush strokes. And now the weathering. And this is where things really start to fall apart on me here. So yeah, I mixed some acrylic paints and I made a nice mud mixture. And then I started to apply it. Have you noticed my mistake yet? If you said that he was scrubbing from left to right in a really consistent pattern, then you nailed it. So why does that matter? Well, it doesn't if I was going to make this look like wood, but I'm not going for wood, dang it, this is the Millennium Falcon. I'm not trying to build the Pirates of the Caribbean ship room here. All right, I'll calm down. The bottom line here is, I wasn't going for a wood look, and I didn't listen to my friend Greg. You remember Greg from the What a Piece of Junk YouTube channel? Yeah. Greg is the guy that pioneered the technique that we're about to see for creating these iconic pads, because he built a full-scale Millennium Falcon cockpit, and I didn't listen. So how do we come to the correct look? Shop towels. You heard me, shop towels. The blue kind seem to work the best for me. Yep, you need to tear sheets of shop towels. And then, and this is the really tedious part, you have to tear away all the straight edges on all 4 sides of every towel. You don't want any of the towels to have anything but a jagged edge. And yeah, you're gonna need a lot of them. So then you go back to your ugly failed pad and you add more Mod Podge, and then you start laying in the towels. Each one of these gets carefully laid on top of another, making sure that those edges are a little bit overlapping, as well as adding Mod Podge to the top. This creates a bond and it glues them all together. And it also makes the texture of the towels pop out, which is actually what we're looking for. Beyond the texture, you can actually go in and pinch to add extra wrinkles and cracks. And also, remember those big gouges we made with the rotary tool? You can actually stuff the paper towel down into those cracks and add more of the Mod Podge. Now, once you work this for a bit, you're gonna end up with a great texture. But be warned, you can overdo this technique, and I did. I ended up making an entire set additionally to these pads because I had way too much going on. Less is more often than I would like to admit. Let's talk about weathering again. And yes, I went through and repainted the pads with that same off-cream color the same way I did before. This time, however, I mixed the paint the same way, but added more water. And then instead of trying to use the brush for everything, I did the pat towel technique that I might have to rename the D-trick. Thanks, Greg. With the cheap brush, I used it to apply the paint, but then I used the towel to dab it away consistently. This pulls up most of the paint from the surface but leaves it in the cracks. And I also kept a spray bottle on hand so I could water it down in places that I needed to remove more of the paint. And as the towels got dirty, I didn't throw them away. I kept using a variety of them. The more grime and filth, the better. It added another layer of texture to the pads. I should add that there's a step here that I didn't show you. Before we added the weathering, I sprayed everything down with a clear coat. This served a couple of purposes. One, it protected the bottom layer of latex paint from coming apart with all the water. And two, it added another layer of rigidity to the entire pad. There's going to be a lot of people and kids interacting in this space, and I don't want any damage if I can help it. I also went back and applied the same clear coat after we did the weathering, and that will protect our weathering finish. Okay, so let's go ahead and install part of this thing. I went ahead and painted a large section of the wall without you. I'm sure you'll forgive me for that. And then we went ahead and laid out our first pad. Now, to get this to sit where I wanted, I cut a couple of blocks of plywood and put them at the base the right distance and clamp them down. This will give me a secure place to set the pad against. After that, I went ahead and started applying contact cement. You need to use the contact cement on both the wall and the pad. Now, here's a critical error that I almost made the mistake. You need to make sure you seal the back of the foam. In my case, I just did 2 layers more of Mod Podge on the back and let it fully cure. The reason is, if you apply that contact cement directly on the foam, it's just going to chew right through it, and then you won't have a flat surface to glue against. So, once both sides are tacky, you can go ahead and put them together. Put your pad in place. But keep in mind, you've only got one shot at this really. There's not a lot of time to reposition. The contact cement makes almost an instant bond. I didn't want these pads to butt right up against each other. So I used wire loom between each pad, and that gave me some tubing and that kind of textured look. It just so happens that the wire loom I used is exactly the right length for what I needed. Wow, that never happens to me. I then added 1 greebly on the base pad because I could not help myself. But in order to do this, I actually drilled out 4 of the holes. Yes, I drilled into the foam. The reason was I was able to stream in a little CA glue into each hole, as well as a little CA glue on each of the hex head bolts that I used to fasten the whole thing down. Surprisingly enough, this held incredibly well. I don't know if it'll stand the test of time, but right now it's a super tight bond. After that step, it's just all about adding another pad and another set of the wire loom and then another pad after that. Geeks, I'm getting kind of excited that there's some things starting to happen, and I think we're off to a pretty decent start on this series. Now, in the meantime...
Do you know what I've learned over the years of doing room builds and numerous other projects? Yes, the room build may never be finished, but more importantly, my skills have changed, my techniques improved, and my tastes have been altered. In the first build of this series, you saw us build an old school wall control panel. And as much as I liked it, I realized later that there were things about it I wanted to change. And that's something that's so important for you on your projects. If you feel like changing something, if you feel like improving something, you just have to go and do it. So let's take a look at what we changed and how we altered this project for the room build.
Today in the Smugglers Room, we're assembling, wiring, and programming a new control panel. This code is called Bad Motivator. Wow, maybe we'll just write a code that makes the lights blink. Yeah, I think that might be safer. That's coming up. Now we're starting out with a pre-cut, assembled, and painted frame. This design might look a little familiar to you if you've seen our wall control panel video. So if you want to see how it's all put together and painted, go ahead and check that in the link in the description below. Different than our original build, we're going to change up the design a bit and start out with some of those iconic Star Wars colored tiles, as well as a Blue Realm oval light design, but more on that in a bit. And then finally, some classic Falcon rocker switches, 3 of them. We also went to work adding surface detail to the panel, and this time around, I'm going to drill and bolt as many things down as I can. In the first version of the Smuggler's Room, we used my body weight in hot glue. And in case you were wondering, that's a bantha load of hot glue. And not as durable as it turns out, as I thought. Next, we moved on to the mechanical section of this build. And here we have a bunch of really great looking greeblies, all of which needed no paint or any other adjustment to make them fit in this section of the panel. And as a matter of fact, some of these parts actually move, which should be another level of interaction and a treat for guests to find and discover while they're here. We also have some openings in this design, and for here we want to add additional depth and texture to those areas. So we dug through all of our bin parts until we found some interesting items and then glued and bolted those into place. From there we did more detail by layering in other items that hopefully in the end will be completely unrecognizable. The overall goal with this project is to completely immerse a visitor in the space, so that every nook and cranny is filled with something different or unusual, and this will help take that person and transport them away and not feel like they're in a basement of a home. I mentioned in our Great Greeblies episode that heat sinks are amazing, and I just happen to have a pair that are perfect for this project and the space provided. In these large recessed areas was enough room to add a couple more oddities, and I'll let you determine if you can figure out exactly what these pieces are. One other element that can add a level of detail is layering. And in this case, we're taking old circuit boards that we stripped from electronics and placing them in and around the heat sinks. I'll tell you, the more layers you can build into your projects, the better storytelling that project will provide. My outfeed table has a partial track system, and I can't tell you how many times I've used this in conjunction with working on a project. Now, when I rebuild this outfeed table, we are going to up our game when it comes to the track system, and I'll be taking you with me. Typically when I install LEDs, I have to solder on a resistor, but in this case, these LEDs come with a pre-wired and built-in resistor. I am super excited about this because of the amount of time it's going to save me. Now, I'll put a link to these LEDs in the description below, as well as all the other materials that we use in this project. Okay, next we installed our SparkFun Red board, which is very similar to an Arduino Uno. Even the pins are mostly the same. And once that was all installed, we went ahead and wrote a simple program. Alright, to write the code for this project, I used the Arduino IDE free software, which is great because free. And I'm going to do the best I can to show you what I did, but please keep in mind that I'm a hack programmer. So I'm also linking in the description below to the Programming Electronics Academy. This is a YouTube channel that is full of great information. This is a place for you to dive in and take a look if you're interested in programming code for your projects. Let's see what I did. We simply start out by identifying what the project is and putting as many notes as possible. This is a great habit to get into. Next, we initialize the naming convention with the function. So in this case, LED 1 equals pin 5. In our program, we're going to be using pins 5 through 13, which we identified up here in the description. And yes, when I copied and pasted, I forgot to change LED 1 to the correct label, but we'll fix that in a sec. Remember, I said hack programmer. Next, we drop a few notes on the setup and identify that our pins are going to act as outputs for this program. We need to identify this function for all the pins we're going to use to illuminate our LEDs. And finally, we can code the loop functionality, which is simply going to be all the LEDs continuously in operation for however long there is a power to the board. When we write the code, we indicate the function name is either high or low, followed by a short delay. High meaning the LED is on, low meaning that it is off. We want to test that the code is working, but also that our LEDs are working before we continue. So we go ahead and upload our program, which is also called a sketch, and then we should see the results. If we did everything correct, all of our LEDs should turn on. And boom, we did it. Now to create an animation, a fancy way of saying make all the lights blink. We can copy our code and make changes over and over again. I've found that making 1 or 2 changes at a time is a better effect than changing everything at once. Subtly turning on lights and turning off lights seems to give a better effect. And if we're flashing everything all at once, we're likely to give our guests a seizure, which isn't the idea. I don't think. Then we upload our sketch one more time, and presto, we have animated LEDs. We also had to drill a hole in each of the 4 corners of the panel, and then transfer that pattern to the actual wall. This way we could drill and mount that panel to the wall and it was secure. And in case you were wondering if I figured out exactly how all of this is going to get installed once it's down in the room, I haven't. But I will. And now it's finally time for some weathering. Look away, Mom, it's about to get dirty in here. Alright, we got the panel installed on the wall and it looks pretty great. I'm excited with how this is coming along. But there is a little bit of a disconnect between part 1 and part 2. Not to mention, we need to finish the columns on the wall. But we're going to tie all of this together, I promise. We're going to use tubes and weathering and all kinds of other weird and crazy stuff to make this look like one solid piece. Now, next week we're going to take just...
Alright, we've done a lot of different work. It's time to actually get this wall put in its place in the actual room and add all of those subtle details. So let's not waste any more time and do that right now.
Let's get this thing installed and greeblified. We should probably start with the columns, which I've already painted. I know, you're super sad right now having not watched me spray 3 layers and still miss spots. But I'm trying to keep the boring stuff from you. The big goal was to have the pipe work and other interesting things going on inside the columns. Can we take a moment to thank the gods of plumbing for PVC pipe? I mean, it's pretty much Legos for adults, who use them for other things besides plumbing. At any rate, I mixed and matched all types of fittings that I found in the plumbing aisle and did my best to arrange them in a way that would add the most interest. Keep in mind, you'll only see these from the sides under low light, so it doesn't have to be perfect, but you will want to secure them in place the best you can. I used mostly 5-minute epoxy and PVC glue for this. Now, in the basement, we see the condition of the walls after the original Smugglers room was taken down. You can see there have been many holes in the wall, but don't tell my wife just how many. I've kept that a pretty good secret from her thus far. I used a stud finder to mark out the framing behind the drywall, and then childishly, of course, tried to use it on me, but we should probably rename it the Geek Finder for that. Then I marked out the stud locations and installed 3 horizontal pieces of material that we could then mount the structure to. Then I moved the base wall unit into place, drilled new pilot holes, countersunk, and screwed it into our backing material. Then I manhandled the top piece into position, wishing I was in better shape and not such a chubby geek, and then repeated the process. Once the back was on, we could then install both columns and secure them into place. Next up was installing the control panel we made for this wall, and fishing the power through the wall. And for all my AV friends out there, that means adding a service tab to your tape job for easy removal. If you want to see how we built this control panel, I'll provide a link in the description below. We also installed the movie poster and both covers for the columns, which were screwed into place so they could be removed later if needed. Now we need to add a good detail more to the wall, so I began adding greeblies and flex tubing to various parts of the project. These details will hopefully add more layers to the room and sell the overall look. Once we finish, I hope to have a fully immersive space, which means we need to fill any dead areas in the project with something that adds interest. When the project is complete, there will be tubing and fixtures and all other manner of detail throughout the space, and you'll truly feel like you're in another place. Next, we added the pads. You know, those elements of foam covered in paper towels that we spent all that time making? Yep, they needed installed on the columns. Thankfully, when I built them, I made them fit as tightly as possible because I didn't want to have to glue every pad, especially to the column panels that we needed to have access to. I made a strip of MDF that I could use as a spacer and installed the pads one at a time. I realized during the pad install that I would need to make a custom pad to go around our column control panel. That's why the piece is still pink foam, so I'll need to address that soon to give it a finished look. Now it occurs to me that you might not have really ever seen the basement fully. And that's sort of by design. You see, it's been a hot mess down here since we took the original Smugglers room down. So let's go ahead and have a tour, warts and all. You see, I want you to have a look at it in its current state so that you can fully see the transformation that we are going to attempt. You see, I very much want to show you the space in its current form and line that up with the 3D renderings I showed you at the start of this project. Specifically the crash couch, or hull couch, however you prefer it. It's a long way from done, but I'll break down the construction we've done already so that you'll understand how that part of the project was done. And of course, we have a great deal of work to do on the Han and Carbonite section of the room as well. The surrounding display for that area is going to be completely redone, and we have a totally geeked out idea for what we're going to work on. And the bar, because what kind of space-worthy smuggler's ship would this be without a properly stocked and operated bar? So, as you can see, we have a ton of work that needs to be done, but we hope you'll stick with us until the end, because that is only the beginning of what we're going to bring you on this channel. There are many people that saw the room in its first rendition that think I'm crazy for starting all over again from scratch, and they ask me why. In addition to not having it done right the first time, I really enjoy building something out of nothing.
Lighting. Lighting is one of the most important things you can do in your room build to give it that perfect atmosphere. But we can't just put any old type of lighting fixture in the room. We need something that's completely unique. We need something that is unrecognizable for what it is. We need some kind of storm drain. And we need to make it a light.
Okay, so let's get a set of color changing puck lights and a Pro Series channel drain kit, and we'll build a light. Wait, didn't I tell you we were going to use the drain kit that you'd put in the front of your garage door to create a light fixture? Yeah, that's what we're doing. Come on, I'll show you. Yeah, don't throw that away. We'll save it for the next episode. Basically here, there isn't much to it. I just installed the puck lights at the bottom of the drain, notched a hole, and connected them all up. It was about as simple as install as you could hope for. Just some leftover laser cut pieces I had laying around. But you could use just about anything to detail up your light, which also covers up all those pesky plastic factory markings. You feeling that intensity yet? I know, serious stuff right here. Whoa, wait, where did you get those? Oh, eBay. Search hard drive motor lots. Happy hunting. And the weathering, my friends, don't forget the weathering. And why do we weather? 'Cause space is filthy. Now we're just installing the light in here temporarily, just suspending it from the drop ceiling grid so that I can see how it looks. I wanted to see it in the space so it'll help me with some of the design decisions. I like it. I'll tell you right now, it's not the cheapest piece I've found from Home Depot. Now I know that this might have seemed a little bit like a simpler project this week, but I'll tell you, finding a light fixture or building a light fixture from scratch that worked in this environment was a big challenge. And though it cost a little bit more money to buy something like the drain, this is gonna help me duplicate it for the 3 or 4 different times in this space that I'm gonna have to do it. You see, I want some consistency in the fixtures around the space. So it was spend a little bit more money or spend a little bit more time, and this seemed to work pretty well for me. Now, next week, we're gonna go ahead and finish.
As much fun as that lighting fixture project was, it's clearly not finished. So let's take the last step in this wall build marathon and give it a proper ceiling to tie it all together. What's up, you awesome geeks? I'm Brian and welcome to the Smugglers Room. This week, this chubby geek wants to add one more layer to our ongoing room build and give a proper home to our drain pipe lighting project. So let's get to it. So since we're working on the room and we're working on this angled pitch or angled section of the roof, the first thing I did was took a piece of 1/4 inch MDF and we cut a bevel right down the edge of it here. And this will serve as the foundation, as the base of our actual ceiling piece. So the next thing we want to do is add some layers to the top of it. The layers were cut out on the laser cutter by adding in a lot of various designs. And the thought was I could add these in a section at a time and lay them out on our piece of MDF. We have the opportunity to add a more three-dimensional piece that would sit inside here. This panel has 3 recessed areas that I plan on using these pieces of plastic to sit down inside each hole. Now, one of the great things about this hobby is finding everyday items that you can use in your project just by looking at them a little differently. These pieces of plastic are no exception. I actually work at my day job for an audio-video manufacturer that sells lighting, a keypad lighting dimmer. Let's take a look in this box and let me show you what I'm talking about. This is a Control-4 keypad. It's used in automation systems. And inside is actually a set of keypad buttons. These are the buttons that go on in different configurations that functions and controls your lighting. We're gonna be using a lot of this automation lighting in the room build, but in this case, I'm actually more interested in the packaging. The packaging itself, where all the vacuum form parts for all the buttons, has an awesome detail. And it's just one of those examples of something as mundane as a plastic package that would add a whole nother level to your sci-fi project. For this panel right here, I want to take advantage of this cutout area. We can put some recessed parts and pieces behind here. Now that we got that hole cut out, the next thing we need to do is glue all the individual panels down to our 1/4 inch MDF, and then we can go ahead and seal the entire outside. We're gonna have to do at least 2 or 3 layers of sealant. That way when we paint, we get a nice smooth finish. Okay, so we have our angled panel, but we need a way to mount it to the wall. So all I did was make an angled bracket out of 3/4 inch plywood. This way you can have a 45-degree angle to keep our panel in the orientation that we want, and a way to mount it to the MDF wall we previously installed. So we've got our angled panel, but we also need a ceiling panel. We need something with structure that our light can mount to. And if you want to see how we built that light, you can check out the links above and in the description below and watch that project in full. For the ceiling panel, we want it to be flush with the edge of the front of our column, but wide enough for the light to mount. And we need to fill that with layers of detail. I also want to include a bit of pipe work with some PVC and some greeblies. We'll use electrical boxes, simply juice lids, and other junk from around the shop to do that. One of the craziest aspects of this build is the way that it's constructed, meaning that I have to flip it upside down and backwards when it's sitting on my table versus how it's going to be when it's mounted to the ceiling. So everything has to be kind of looked at in a certain way and imagined what it's going to look like when it's flipped around upside down and put in its proper orientation. So hopefully we get it right. One of the things with the room build we're constantly thinking about is depth and texture. Meaning, when we put this ceiling piece up, we want it to have multiple layers. Add dimensionality to the structure. That way you have places for the weathering to get into the nooks and crannies, but also the way light plays across the surface, creating shadows and depth across the entire piece. This is a lot more interesting than if it was just flat and painted. Those little recesses and all those different elements make it more interesting to look at.
Getting all of this installed and filming it is a little bit more of a challenge than I was able to overcome. But all said, everything went in as smoothly as I had hoped. The brackets we made out of plywood were able to attach that angled panel, and then the ceiling, as big as it is, it's really lightweight, and so I was able to just lift it up, slide it into position, and then attach it to the columns as well as the stringer to the ceiling. I have to tell you, I'm really pleased with how this turned out. Every step we take gets us a little bit closer to the end of this project, but now I'm starting to actually be able to visualize what it's really going to look like as we take each step. One thing I'm really looking forward to is having guests over and watching them as they discover every nook and cranny and finding new details with every turn. So we hope you've picked up a few tips today, that you learned something you didn't know before, and it's given you the motivation and the knowledge to get out there yourself and build something out of nothing.